There's a certain kind of silence that only exists by the sea. The kind that hums beneath the sound of waves, where every breath feels borrowed from another time. And if you listen long enough, you might hear the faint flicker of a promise. They say love never truly dies, it just waits for the right night to return. You're listening to Love and Us. If you believe some hearts still find each other, even after the last goodbye, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Sparkling Heart, tonight's story is called The Lantern Keeper's Kiss. The wind carried salt through the air, weaving it through the narrow cobblestone streets of the seaside village. It was Halloween night, the kind that wrapped the world in silver fog, where even the stars seemed too shy to shine. Eleanor Hayes tightened her scarf as she locked the small door of her seaside cottage. The brass key clicked softly, echoing in the empty street. She hesitated before stepping into the mist. She didn't know where she was going, only that something inside her chest whispered, "Go." Every year, around this same time, the villagers would talk about the light. They said a lantern glowed faintly from the cliffs beyond town, from the old lighthouse that had been abandoned for nearly 30 years. No one ever dared to climb that way anymore. The path had crumbled, and the sea had swallowed much of it whole. But Eleanor was never one for superstition. She believed in what she could feel, and tonight, she felt it. A pulse. A pull. Something that told her this night was different. In the village cafe earlier that afternoon, the locals had whispered the old story again, just as they did every Halloween. They said the lantern keeper was a man named Thomas Vale, who tended the lighthouse alone through every storm. He was kind, soft-spoken, and deeply in love with a woman who promised to return to him from the city one autumn evening. But that night, the sea had other plans. A sudden squall rose from nowhere. The winds tore through the coast, the waves devoured the docks, and by morning, the lighthouse stood dark and broken. Thomas was never seen again. And yet, every Halloween since, when the fog rolled thick and the wind fell silent, a light flickered once more at the top of the cliffs. The villagers called it a ghost's vigil. A love that refused to fade. Eleanor never said it out loud, but every time she heard the story, something in her heart ached in a way she couldn't explain. Like a memory that wasn't hers. Like she was remembering a promise she never made, but somehow still meant. The road to the cliffs was steep and uneven. Eleanor's boots sank into the damp earth as she made her way up, guided only by the sound of the waves crashing below. Fog coiled around her ankles like smoke. The wind whispered through the tall grass, bending it toward the sea. Halfway up the path, she stopped to catch her breath, and that's when she saw it. A light. Faint at first, no brighter than a candle flame, but steady, alive. Her pulse quickened. It was real. The villagers hadn't imagined it. Something, or someone, had lit the lantern again. She hesitated. Every part of her said to turn back, to go home, to lock the door, to pretend she'd never seen it. But curiosity has a strange way of becoming courage when the heart leads the way. And Eleanor's heart was leading her straight toward that glow. The old lighthouse stood tall against the fog, its stones slick with rain. The wooden door was half-rotted, hanging on a single hinge. She pushed it open slowly. It groaned in protest. Inside, the air smelled of salt, oil, and dust. Her footsteps echoed on the spiral stairs as she began to climb. Every creak of the steps sounded like a memory trying to speak. As she reached the top, she saw it, the great lantern, its flame dancing behind cracked glass. But what made her breath catch was the man standing beside it. He wasn't young, but not old either, his dark hair streaked with silver, his eyes reflecting both the flame and the sea beyond. He wore an old mariner's coat, the kind she'd only seen in history books. For a moment, they both simply stared at each other, two souls caught between disbelief and recognition. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. His voice was low, gentle, achingly familiar. I saw the light," she managed. "I thought no one lived here anymore." He smiled faintly, a shadow of sorrow touching the edges of his lips. "No one does. Not anymore." Something in the way he said it, calm, final, and full of weight, made her heart stumble. "Then who are you?" she asked. He looked past her, toward the horizon where the sea met the fog. A keeper, he said after a long pause. Of what remains? The light flickered again, and in its glow, Eleanor noticed the name carved into the base of the lantern stand. T. Vale. Her breath caught. Thomas Vale. His eyes flicked toward her, startled, just for a moment. How do you know that name? I don't know, she whispered, trembling. I've just heard it. He stepped closer, studying her face as though searching for something lost. For a second, the air around them changed, warmer, softer, as if the fog itself was listening. You've been here before, he said finally, his voice distant, certain. Eleanor shook her head. I haven't. He tilted his head slightly, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. Maybe not in this life. Her heart froze. What do you mean? But he didn't answer. He only turned back to the window, staring at the ocean as the waves shimmered under the pale moonlight. Sometimes, he said quietly, love doesn't know how to stop waiting. Eleanor looked at the lantern again. Its light never wavered, burning steady in a room untouched by time. Who lights it every year? She asked. Who keeps it going? He turned to her, his expression unreadable. I do. When the world grows quiet enough to let me through. Her pulse raced. You mean, you're a memory, he interrupted gently. Or maybe a wish that never stopped burning. The room grew colder. The fog outside pressed against the glass like soft hands. Eleanor's throat tightened. She didn't know whether to run or to reach for him. Instead, she whispered, then why am I here? His eyes softened. Because you always come back. The clock inside the lantern tower struck midnight. Outside, the storm began to stir again, wind howling through the broken stones. Thomas turned to her fully, his form clearer now, the edges of him solid in the lantern's glow. He looked real. Alive. And yet, something in her heart knew otherwise. I waited, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Every year, I waited, hoping you'd find the light again. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. She didn't understand why his words hurt so much, or why her heart felt like it remembered him. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't know. He smiled gently, stepping closer. You never do, until you do. The light flickered between them, painting their faces in gold and shadow. And for one fragile moment, the fog outside parted, revealing the sea, endless and alive. Do you believe in promises? He asked quietly. I want to, she said. Then believe this, he said, his gaze locking with hers. No matter the storms, no matter the years, love will always find its way home. The lantern flared once, brighter than before, then dimmed. Eleanor blinked, and he was gone. Only the sound of the waves remained, and the faint warmth of a promise she didn't yet understand. A year passed, though time had moved differently for Eleanor ever since that night. Every evening, she would walk the same stretch of shore, listening to the waves and watching the horizon for the faint flicker of a light that never came. Until now. It was late October again, the season of fog and firelight. The village had already dressed itself in pumpkins and laughter, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something waited for her beyond the noise. As the first night of Halloween fell, she stepped out onto her porch and looked toward the cliffs. There it was. The light. Soft and steady, not imagined, not reflected. It pulsed, like a heartbeat in the dark. Her breath hitched. Thomas. Without hesitation, she grabbed her lantern and began the climb. The path was even rougher this time. Rain had eroded the steps, and moss clung to the stones. The sea wind carried whispers through the fog, voices that almost sounded like her name. Halfway up, she stopped to catch her breath and looked down. The village below looked like a dream, distant lights flickering through the mist. She could almost imagine how he must have seen it, all those lonely years ago, keeping watch through storms. When she reached the top, the door was already open. Just like before. The air inside was cold, but it hummed, like the heartbeat of the sea itself. And there he was. standing by the lantern, his back turned toward her, as if no time had passed. "Thomas," she whispered. He turned slowly. His expression softened, half relief, half disbelief. "You came back." She nodded, stepping closer. "You told me to find you." A quiet smile curved on his lips. "And you remembered." "I've been remembering all year," she said. "But I don't understand. How can you be here?" He looked toward the flame, its glow reflecting in his eyes. "I light the way when the veil thins. Once a year, the lantern burns for those who still believe." "Believe in what?" "In love that refuses to stay buried." He motioned for her to sit near the window. The sea outside roared softly, but the tower itself was calm, warm even. The light painted the walls in honey and gold, just as it must have when he was alive. "I thought I'd imagined you," she said quietly. "After last year, I tried to tell myself it was just the fog, or the sea, or loneliness." Thomas studied her face, his gaze tender but heavy with something unspoken. "Sometimes loneliness is what lets the truth through," he said. "The living world is too loud to hear what the heart remembers." She tilted her head, confused. "What does my heart remember?" He hesitated. "Me." Her breath caught. He reached into his coat and pulled out something small, a rusted silver locket, its surface etched with tiny waves. He placed it gently in her hand. Eleanor opened it. Inside was a faded picture of a woman who looked exactly like her. Same eyes. Same smile. Only, from another time. Her pulse quickened. "That's you," he said softly. "Or at least, you once were." Thomas stood by the lantern again, his hand resting on its iron frame. "When I died, I thought I'd lost everything," he said. "But I kept the light burning. Every year, I waited, hoping you'd find it again, hoping the sea would bring you back." Eleanor could hardly speak. "You're saying I've lived before?" He turned to her, his expression filled with quiet sorrow. "Love doesn't always get it right the first time." Tears welled in her eyes. "Then why don't I remember?" "Because memory fades," he said gently. "But love doesn't. It finds new skin, new breath, new hearts to hide in, until the promise is fulfilled." The wind outside howled, rattling the window panes. The flame flickered, and for an instant, the room seemed to shift, old and new, past and present overlapping like waves. Eleanor looked at him again, and this time, she saw flashes, not visions, but feelings. Salt on her lips. A storm. A man's hand reaching through the dark, whispering her name. A promise made in the rain. Her voice trembled. "It was you." Thomas smiled, that same familiar, heart-stopping smile she hadn't realized she'd missed until now. "It was always me." Hours passed like seconds. They spoke of everything and nothing, their lives, their dreams, the ache of remembering what the world had forgotten. Outside, the fog had thickened until the sea disappeared completely. It was as if they were floating between worlds. Thomas poured her tea. She could feel the warmth of it, the scent of chamomile. It was real, every detail. "How can this be?" she asked. "If you're not alive, how can I touch you?" He looked at his own hands, as though wondering the same. "I think love gives shape to what's left," he said quietly. "When you believe enough, even ghosts can remember how to live." Eleanor laughed softly through her tears. "That sounds like something you used to tell me." He smiled. "Maybe I did." The clock struck midnight. The lantern flame surged brighter, flooding the tower in gold light. Thomas stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "This is the moment the worlds overlap," he whispered. "When the sea breathes both life and memory." Eleanor could feel her heart pounding. "Will I lose you again?" He cupped her cheek, his touch warm, heartbreakingly human. "Only until the light returns. But this time, you'll remember." The wind outside calmed. The fog glowed silver in the lantern's reflection. Their eyes met, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, they didn't look away. When their lips met, it wasn't just a kiss. It was 1,000 nights collapsing into one breath. The sound of the sea vanished. The world vanished. Only warmth, salt, and the pulse of something eternal remained. And then, the lantern flickered. The air grew cold again. Thomas's form began to shimmer, fading like the last trace of sunlight before dusk. "Thomas!" she cried, reaching for him. He caught her hand, held it firm, even as his outline turned to mist. "Don't cry," he whispered. "This isn't the end. Love doesn't end, it waits." And then he was gone. The lantern dimmed to a soft ember, its light no longer golden, but pale and trembling. The sea roared once more below, as if reclaiming its own. Eleanor sat by the lantern until dawn, her fingers pressed to the glass where his hand had been. The first light of morning painted the sea in silver, and for a moment, she thought she saw him there, standing on the rocks, smiling. But when she blinked, there was only mist. She opened the locket again. The woman's image was gone. In its place was a small pressed flower, white and dry, but perfectly preserved. Something that hadn't been there before. She closed it and whispered to the wind, "I'll wait too." Back in the village, no one believed her story. They smiled politely when she spoke of the man in the lighthouse. Some said it was the sea playing tricks, others said it was loneliness. But every night, she'd look toward the cliffs and see a faint shimmer, not a full light, but a promise. And that was enough. Because she now knew that love didn't need to be touched to be real. It only needed to be remembered. They say the heart always knows the way home, even if the path has been swallowed by time, even if it takes 100 years and 1,000 waves. Sometimes, all it takes is a single light to remind us that love still lives here. And as Halloween approaches once more, the villagers will again see the glow from the cliffs, steady and warm, and wonder who keeps it burning. But Eleanor knows. Because love, once lit, never truly goes dark. The sea was calm this October. The waves rolled in with slow, thoughtful rhythm, as though the ocean itself had grown old with her. Eleanor Hayes sat by the window of her seaside cottage, watching the horizon blur into a grey-blue dream. Her hair had silvered more since last year. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her cup of tea, but her eyes still glowed with that quiet, steady light. On the table beside her sat the old silver locket, the one Thomas had given her, the one she now wore every day. Sometimes she swore she could feel a faint heartbeat inside it, pulsing with the rhythm of the tide. Tonight would be her 3rd Halloween since the night she found him, and she knew, deep in her chest, that this one would be different. The afternoon sun sank lower, staining the clouds with gold and rose. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the village square, trick-or-treaters running door to door, lanterns swinging like tiny stars. Eleanor smiled softly, but her mind was far away. She could feel it again, that subtle pull, that invisible thread tugging at her soul. When the clock struck 6, she stood and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. The sea breeze greeted her like an old friend. She began to walk toward the cliffs. The path hadn't gotten any easier, but her steps were sure, unhurried. She'd made this climb before, twice, and each time, she'd felt closer to something eternal. Halfway up, she stopped to rest her hand against the stones. The fog had begun to thicken, curling around her feet like gentle hands. And then she saw it, faint at first, then steady. The lantern was already burning. Her heart swelled. "Thomas," she whispered. The light pulsed once, as if answering. The lighthouse door creaked open with the same weary sigh it always had. Inside, the air was colder than she remembered, or maybe she was just feeling the years. She climbed the spiral staircase slowly, the lantern's glow drawing her upward. And when she reached the top, he was there. Thomas stood by the great lantern, exactly as before, tall, calm, the faintest smile on his lips. But something in his eyes had changed. There was peace in them now. "You came back," he said softly. "Of course," she breathed. "You knew I would." He nodded, his gaze tracing her face like a memory rediscovered. I hoped, he said. But time has its own tides. Eleanor laughed lightly. Then let's not waste what's left of it. He chuckled, and for a moment, it was as if nothing had ever separated them. The sound of his voice filled the room like sunlight. They stood together by the lantern, the flame reflecting in their eyes. Thomas, she said after a moment, tell me the truth. Why does it happen like this? Once a year, one night only. Why can't it last? He looked out toward the sea. Because love belongs to both worlds, he said quietly. To life, and to what comes after. The light bridges the two, but only when the veil is thin enough for us to meet. So this is our bridge. He nodded. Our promise. She stepped closer, her hand reaching for his. Her fingers brushed his, and this time, they didn't pass through. His hand was solid, warm, alive. Then maybe, she whispered, tonight I'll stay on this side. He looked at her with both awe and fear. If you do, he said, there's no going back. The living can't hold the light forever. It burns too bright. Eleanor smiled sadly. I'm tired of shadows, Thomas. I want to see what waits beyond the fog. The clock struck 11. Outside, the wind began to rise, the sea's voice deepening into a low, endless hum. Thomas lit another wick, and the lantern's flame grew, brighter, stronger, illuminating the entire tower in gold. It felt less like fire and more like memory itself, alive and breathing. They stood together, watching the light pulse between them. It's beautiful, she whispered. He nodded. It always was. I kept it burning, waiting for you to see it again. Tears glimmered in her eyes. I see it now. Thomas turned to her, his expression soft and certain. Then promise me something. Anything. When the dawn comes, if I'm gone, don't mourn me. The light doesn't end with me. It moves through those who keep it burning. Eleanor smiled through her tears. You always talk like a poet. He laughed gently. Only because you listened like one. Midnight came quietly. The fog pressed close to the glass, wrapping the lighthouse in silver silence. Eleanor and Thomas stood inches apart, the flame between them steady, perfect. This is our hour, he whispered. She nodded. Then let's not waste a second. He reached out, brushing her cheek with trembling fingers. The warmth of his touch melted every year of waiting, every lonely night, every question that had haunted her. When they kissed, it was nothing like the last time. No fear, no goodbye hidden behind the taste of salt. This was a kiss of arrival, of coming home. The world around them shimmered, light bleeding into the walls, the floor, the air itself. The lantern flared white gold, swallowing everything in brilliance. And then, silence. Only the sound of the sea, and the whisper of a promise kept. When the villagers woke the next morning, they found the fog had cleared. The cliffs glistened with dew, and the sea was calm, unnaturally calm. But what caught their eyes most was the light. The old lighthouse, long abandoned and broken, shone brighter than it ever had, a golden beam cutting through the daylight like the sun itself. They said it stayed lit all that day, and when it finally dimmed, two figures were seen standing together at the edge of the cliffs, hand in hand, before fading into the mist. No one ever saw Eleanor Hayes again. But her cottage remained warm, the kettle always half full, the locket resting open on her table. Inside, pressed against the glass, was a single white flower. Fresh. Untouched by time. Years later, travelers would pass through the coastal village and hear the story of the lantern keeper and the woman who followed his light. Some said it was a ghost tale, others called it a love story. But on certain nights, when the sea is calm and the air carries the scent of rain, people still claim to see two lanterns glowing on the cliffs instead of one. One bright and gold, the other soft and silver. Two lights, forever intertwined. Maybe love isn't about forever. Maybe it's about the moments that burn bright enough to echo through time. Eleanor found her light. Thomas found his peace. And together, they became something eternal. So if you ever find yourself by the sea on a foggy Halloween night, look toward the cliffs. If you see two lights shining side by side, don't be afraid. It's only love, keeping its promise. You've been listening to Love and Us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales where love defies time, reason, and even death. Because here on Love and Us, every heartbeat tells a story. And some stories never fade.